passed.
無立法效力
Motion on Members' motion with no legislative effect. Mr. Wai-keung will move a motion on improving the statutory minimum wage regime. Mr. Hon NGAN will move an amendment to the motion. This council will proceed to a joint debate on the motion and the amendment. Later, I will first call upon Mr. Wai-keung to speak and move the motion. Then I will call upon Mr. Hon NGAN to speak, but he may not move the amendment at this stage. The joint debate now begins. Members who wish to speak, please press the Request to Speak button. I now call upon Mr. Wai-keung to speak and move the motion.
郭偉強議員
Mr. Wai-keung. Thank you, Madam Deputy. I move that the motion as printed on the agenda be passed. The Statutory Minimum Wage, or SMW, has come into force since 2011. It's been 11 years. The original policy intent is to forestall excessively low wages whilst maintaining a reasonable level of living for workers. Well, there is a long-standing problem of SMW rates lagging behind. It can't catch up with rising inflation. It also constitutes as one of the factors to the working poor. In the past 11 years, the local GDP increased by 53.1%. As for CPIA, in the past 11 years, it rose by 36.47%. As for the median hourly rate of income, it rose by 44.5%. However, as for statutory minimum wage, the rate has only increased from $28 to $37.5, up by 33.9%. And under this circumstance, the beneficiary under the SMW regime decreased in number from 180,000 in 2011 to 14,000 in 2021. There are questions in the community that the SMW is no longer effective and it is way out of touch with the market situation. And according to employers, it is impossible to hire any worker at just the SMW rate. And if it is not increased, then it will, in the end, only exist in name. As for the SMW Commission, there are 12 members from different backgrounds, from the academia, from the government, from the business sector, etc. There seems to be balanced participation as each sector would have a few members sitting on the commission. But there is a long-standing conflict between employers and employees. The government doesn't pay attention to the benefits and rights of workers. Instead, they rely on empirical data and have moot point arguments. Now, every time when a review takes place, the government puts forward a number of excuses such as the business environment and competitiveness, and the government also provides data to this extent. And the labor representatives seems to be the only minority voice in the commission. Under the existing mechanism, only when we are sure about the inflation rate can it be reflected in the SMW rate. That means we are always falling behind the inflation rate by 2 years. Now, why is it that when it comes to the lowest echelon of the working population earning only the SMW rate, they still need to wait for 2 years before a pay rise in order to catch up with inflation? In 2021, when there was a freeze in the minimum wage level, our workers had to suffer for a total of 4 years. That means they will need to wait until 2023 before another review of the SMW rate. For the grassroots workers, they don't get a pay hike. They only receive this meager income for 4 years. Meanwhile, between 2019 and 2021, the cumulative inflation rate stood at 4.9%. With lower spending power, that means some people would have to struggle to make ends meet. We need to change this biennial review cycle. I was referring to the increase in inflation rate by 4.9% from 2019. But I didn't mention that the last rate was determined in 2018 based on data available in 2017. So it's really a far cry from reality. If we only have a review once every 2 years, it is not sufficient. According to the relevant ordinance, the Chief Executive should require a report from the Statutory Minimum Wage Commission once every 2 years, and that is only the minimum requirement. And in fact, on different occasions, the government admitted that it is possible to have an annual review instead of a biennial review. In fact, in South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, etc., they also have annual reviews of the minimum wage rates. According to our government, this is not done simply because of technical reasons. So it is not impossible. It is also a departure from the original possible policy intent. According to the poverty report in 2021, among the 1.6 million living in poverty, about 50% of them are working poor. And if we do not increase the SMW rate, they will continue to be left in abject poverty. Now, when the economy improves, why is it that the hardworking employees are still receiving less income than they deserve? This reflects a problem of SMW. The minimum wage level is supposed to allow a worker to meet their daily expenses so that their family can also afford basic education and better living. But now the rate is even lower than CSSA rate. The CSSA rate is adjusted annually, not so for SMW. Say if we have 2 working adults and 2 children in a 4-person household, the CSSA payment is some $17,000. So whereas the working adults would only get $15,600 if they earn only SMW rates. So there is a difference. The minimum wage is supposed to provide an incentive for people to work, but instead it becomes a disincentive if it's excessively low. According to some workers, they work for 10 hours a day at $37.5 and they earn over $10,000 a month, but they need to pay half of the wages, spend half of the wages on rent. If there are special occasions for them to, say, pay a condolence money or otherwise, it would pose a great burden on them. And according to some members, there are so many uncertainties in the global economic outlook, and if we increase the SMW rate, it will further push up the unemployment rate because of heavier cost burden on enterprises. But I think that if we raise the SMW rate, we'll be able to stimulate the local domestic circulation, and this will also stimulate job employment and development of SMEs. As we all know, the property and rental levels are always in the stratosphere in Hong Kong, and according to some surveys, among major cities, the job pays in Hong Kong ranked only the 27th, whereas the living cost ranked the 5th. So imagine how difficult grassroots workers' situation would be. It is an imminent task for the government to tackle the issue of SMW. So I urge the government to take a more proactive role and implement an annual review of minimum wage level to once every year as quickly as possible. Under this disparity situation of strong capitalists and weak workers, to ensure that employees receive minimum wage, enjoy the fruit of success of the economy, and improve their living condition. Thirdly, the government should consider minimum wage as one of the poverty alleviation policies. It should be raised to a higher level, or the result will be futile. Finally, we should review the mechanism for determining the minimum wage level. I urge members to support the original motion. I also urge the government to abide by the spirit of presidency's speech. They should be resolute and bold to tackle challenges and resolve deep-seated social conflicts so that people have a sense of bliss and that there would be development that would benefit everybody in Hong Kong.
I now propose the question to you that Mr. Kwok Wai-keung's motion be passed. Mr. Frankie Ngan. President, first of all, I thank Mr. Kwok Wai-keung for moving this motion on improving the statutory minimum wage regime. SMW was implemented in May 2011. So here are some figures. Back in the year 2011, when the SMW was implemented, there were 180,000 people getting the minimum wage, accounting for 6.4% of the working population. In year 2021, there were only 14,000 people getting the minimum wage, accounting for less than 1%. It shows that a lot of employers are employing people with a wage higher than the $37.5 hourly rate to attract people to work for him. So it defeats the purpose of forestalling excessively low wage. It's the two sides of the same coin. On one side, there are fewer people getting minimum wage, and the poverty situation is being alleviated. On the other side, it means that the minimum wage is so low that it will not support people's livelihood. In the past years, it has been adjusted from $28 to today's $37.5, a 34% increase. However, the CPI, the composite CPI, that is Group A index, it has increased from $75.8 to $104.3, an increase of 38%, even larger than the increase of inflation. Now, the next round of review will be in year 2023. For grassroots workers, they don't have a pay rise for 4 years, and it is, in effect, a pay reduction. Now, for an ordinary worker earning a minimum wage, working 29 days for 8 hours per day, the wage is $9,750. Say half of the money goes to rent for a subdivided unit, then he will be left with less than $5,000. Well, it is okay if he is single, but what if he has a family to support? Poverty issue has always existed in Hong Kong. Since the poverty line was set in the 10 years' time, the poverty population hover around 1.3 million people to 1.65 million people. The poverty rate was around 20.6% to 23.6%. The situation has not improved. According to the poverty report, people in poverty without the CSSA accounts for 664,000 people in Hong Kong. The median household income is $14,200. In my amendments, I mentioned that we have to better fulfill the objective of the SMW. We have to review two elements. That is, first, we have to change the biennial review to a yearly review. Like Dr. Lo Chi-kwong said, a lot of studies and analysis and consultation were required so that there can only be a biennial review. Otherwise, the work cannot be finished. That's the truth. We have a three-stage mechanism involving a large amount of data and a lot of indexes. There has to be a territory-focused consultation to canvass views. In year 2020, there were 110 bodies participating in the discussion, and 412 submissions were received. And then the Commission has to collate and analyze the information and detail, and then publicity. Well, there were so many obstacles. And then only then the SMW rate would be adjusted, and then it would be approved by the EXCO. I think the Minimum Wage Commission should review the procedures and streamline it to avoid repeated discussion. If that's the case, we can definitely do a review once per year. Second, we have to set some key indexes and directives for adjustments of SMW rate. Since a lot of resources have been put into reviewing the SMW, and still there is no consensus. So why don't we include some common factors and also indexes to make the work more flexible? The DAB considers that. Please stop. Next, the Secretary for Labour and Welfare.
President, I thank Mr. Wai-keung for moving this motion and to Mr. NGAN Man-yu for moving an amendment which allows a debate on this very important issue of statutory minimum wage regime. After years of extensive discussion, deliberation, and tripartite negotiations, the minimum wage ordinance was was implemented in May 2011 to provide for labor rights protection. The ordinance established a statutory minimum wage regime to provide a wage floor which forestalls excessively low wages without unduly jeopardizing Hong Kong's labor market flexibility, economic growth, and competitiveness, and minimizing the loss of low-paid jobs. According to the ordinance, the Minimum Wage Commission, or MWC, is required by the Chief Executive to submit a recommendation report on the SMW rate at least once every 2 years. The Commission is composed under Part 3 of the ordinance and comprises members from the government, business sector, labor sector, and academia, and it is obliged to make recommendations on the SMW rate. When reviewing the SMW rate, the Commission would refer to an array of indicators, or AOIs, which covers the general economic conditions, labor market conditions, competitiveness, social inclusion, and the relevant data. They would also study other information obtained from relevant surveys, and they would review the outcome of stress tests conducted under different SMW rate test levels under different economic conditions, and the Commission would also take in views from the society on reviewing SMW rate in order to strike an appropriate balance between forestalling excessively low wages and minimizing the loss of low-paid jobs while taking care of the needs of economic development and competitiveness for Hong Kong. Implemented in May 2011, the initial SMW rate was set as $28 per hour. After 4 upratings, the prevailing rate is $37.5 per hour. Compared to the situation before SMW was implemented, the employment earnings of grassroots employees have improved substantially. In February to April 2022, which is the latest period, the average monthly employment earnings of full-time employees, excluding government employees and live-in domestic workers to whom SMW does not apply, of the lowest decile group, rose cumulatively by 74.2% compared with the pre-SMW period, translating into an increase of 26.2% in real terms after discounting inflation. The SMW rate was raised from $34.5 to $37.5 in May 2019. From May 2011 to May 2019, the cumulative increase in SMW rate was 33.9%, and in the same period, the rise in CPIA was 29.9%, and the extent of the increase was lower than the cumulative increase in SMW rate. In other words, when SMW rate was raised to $37.5 per hour in 2019, it managed to maintain or even exceed the purchasing power in 2011 when the first SMW rate was established. With the concession or with the recession of the Hong Kong economy in the second half of 2019 and the COVID-19 pandemic, the latest figures between February to April 2022, the average monthly employment earnings of full-time employees, excluding government employees and live-in domestic workers to whom SMW does not apply of the lowest SL group, rose cumulatively by 74.2% compared with the pre-SMW period, translating into an increase of 26.2% in real terms after discounting inflation. The Minimum Wage Commission is now carrying out the latest review on SMW level and is required to submit a recommendation report to the Chief Executive in Council by the end of October. The government expects the Commission to fully review relevant data and engage in detailed discussions as with the past, and hopefully the Commission can forge a consensus on the recommended SMW rate. President, I will take in members' views and offer a response in my concluding speech.
Mr. Biu Tang. President, I thank my colleague, Mr. Wai-keung, for moving this motion on SMW. The key is that we have to review the system because it has been in place for 10 years. The last review did not bear fruit. As a result, in fact, the SMW rate has been frozen for 4 years. It is very bad. Now, considering the benefits of SMW back in 2012 and 2016, I was a member representing the labor sector, and there was a lot of discussion as the council concerning SMW. Some people, including Dr. Lo Chi-kwong, said that the implementation of SMW means that the economy was doing well. That's why the economy could cope with the implementation. Now, with the worsening economy under the COVID-19 situation, it shows that a minimum wage is good for the society. I hope members can look at this from a positive, in a positive light. It doesn't just benefit workers. In year 2003 or the time before year 2003, the situation was bad. The unemployment rate was 8%. At the time, there were people without employment, and there were some 50,000 households applying for CSSA. Now, since 2019, we had the Black Lives Violence, and today we still have the epidemic. The unemployment rate has peaked at 7.2%. So how many households apply for CSSA? Well, less than 20,000. Well, we had 50,000 families applying for CSSA. Now we just have 20,000. Are we getting richer? No. It is because the SMW idea has convinced many people that it is better to rely on yourself than applying for CSSA. So this is a systemic benefit, and it is it creates a win-win situation for society. It unleashed the working force, and also the employment rates for middle to old age people are very good. Of course, for employment rates of this group, it is even higher than those for young people. Now, there are several keywords in the motion. First, working poverty. So I have been working as the Poverty Commission for 4 years. So from year 2009 to year 2020, which year had the lowest poverty population before the government's intervention? It was 2011 because the SMW regime was implemented. The minimum wage was set at $28. So it clearly shows that it helps to alleviate working poverty, and also the need for governments to spend its resources to help grassroots families out. And the second keyword is the government to be proactive. Now, this is the biennial review. So like Mr. Wai-keung said, if no consensus was reached, why do we have to wait for 2 years instead of 1 year? Well, even if there is no consensus, can the government issue an administrative direction to adjust the rate? Well, no. You just let it sit for 2 years and let the rates be frozen at $37.5. This is a new era with a new government. We have a new expectation for you. I hope the government can be more proactive. Finally, an annual review. Well, I haven't participated in the discussion as the LAB. However, I have been interacting with the employer side. Well, the yearly review is better because we would all look at the figures for the year, like inflation rate. If the staff side is asking for 5% and the employers are asking for 2%, well, if we look at the figure for the year, it would be easier to get a consensus. Well, if you look at a 2 years figure, then the inflation rate may be as high as 10%, then the ask would be too big for the employer side to agree on. So a yearly review would be easier to provide a consensus. So, thank you. Mr. Dennis Leung. Thank you, President. The situation of strong capitalists and weak workers has long existed in Hong Kong. The grassroots workers' voice has always been unheard. They lack the bargaining power and also the upward mobility opportunities. Despite working a day-to-day, they are still living a hard life. So working poverty is the situation of many families in Hong Kong, and it is also a core problem in society, and it gives rise to intergenerational poverty. The FTU has been urging very earlier on that the SMW should be legislated, and we were pleased that the government listened to our cause. The grassroots workers enjoyed a certain degree of protection, and it was a great step in terms of labor rights. However, it has been 11 years since the SMW ordinance came into place. Working poverty is still serious. The reason is that the HKSAR government has not plugged the loopholes in the system and did not respond to workers' needs. As a result, the objectives were defeated. The intent of the SMW was for grassroots workers to make a living which can meet their basic needs. However, at the beginning, it was set as $28. It was not realistic. And then there was the biennial review. As a result, the SMW rates always lag behind economic growth. And in fact, the increase in SMW rates lags behind the increase in median income as well as CSSA. Since year 2009, the nominal wage for selected trades has an increase of 60%, and the hourly rate has risen by 40%. However, for SMW rate, it was only at 33.9%. It shows that those grassroots workers earning minimum wage cannot share the economic fruit. The SMW was frozen since 2021, and it is still set as $37.5 per hour. Between 2017 and year 2022, the CPI-A index has risen by 10.9%. CSSA is a safety net for people with financial difficulties, and it is only sufficient for the basic needs of life. In fact, the SMW rate is even lower than CSSA rate. Say a four-person family with two working family members. Before year 2016, the SMW rates would be higher than the CSSA. However, after 2016, the CSSA is now set as $16,795 for SMW. If for two working family members earning minimum wage, it would be $15,600. So there is SMW lags behind CSSA by $1,375. So back then there were 180,000 people earning minimum wage, only 6% of the working population. As of now, the minimum wage earner only accounts for 0.5% of the working population. That is $14,300. Well, it is really ridiculous that people earning minimum wage only accounts for less than 1% of the working population. It shows that the SMW rate is totally out of touch, and the number of people protected by the SMW has been on the decrease. The government has to catch up and review seriously the applicability of the current review system. And most importantly, we have to review the SMW rate yearly to make sure that there is reasonable adjustment, and also give grassroots workers dignity. I so submit.
Reverend Canon Peter Kuhn. Mr. President, many grassrooters would like to have a job and have a roof over their head. And last year, the SMW rate was frozen at $37.5. The next review would not take place until 2023, according to this biennial review cycle. That means the pay hike lags behind the CPIA increase and the inflation, and the working class cannot enjoy the fruit of economic development, and it's a vicious cycle. After implementing the SMW regime, there have been a number of adjustments, but then the SMW rate increase could not catch up with increase in rental and other expenses. Between 2011 and 2020, the underlying inflation rate and the SMW rates have changed. Although both registered an increase by 30%, the SMW rate started at a lower baseline, so the increase in SMW rate could not help workers make ends meet. Despite the same rate of increase for inflation and SMW rates, it could not help them address livelihood issues. And the low SMW rates also affected increase in wage levels as a whole. Despite on the surface an increase in wage levels, in fact the increase has been eroded by inflation. And according to the government, according to the current review regime, we have to go through steps such as study, consultation, and due to these reasons, we can only have a review once every 2 years. However, as long as we could forge consensus in the community, it may be possible to revise this cycle. And according to some, if we change the review cycle to once every year, this will cause wage levels to go up. But I think reference can be made to the civil service pay adjustment. We can adopt a set of methodology to review and adjust the SMW rates. If the government officials and civil servants can have pay adjustments according to changes in the cost of living, why is it that for SMW rates it won't be reviewed once a year? I hope that the government can be pragmatic. Since we have a new term of government, I hope some new thinking can be adopted to resolve livelihoods issues. The presidency has put forward 4 expectations. The third expectation is to strive to resolve livelihood issues. Presidency would like to have fair distribution of economic success in the community, and that wage earners should be able to be treated fairly so as to improve the living of their family members as well. I so submit. Mr. Kingsley Wong, I speak in support of this motion. Presidency appealed to the Hong Kong SL government to live up to people's expectation, and that the people's aspirations for a better life is what the government should strive for, and that the fruit of development should be evenly distributed to more people in Hong Kong, so that the people would firmly believe that as long as they work hard, they will be able to improve the life of their own and that of their own family. But the SMW rate so far has only risen by 33.9%, below the rate of increase of CPIA. And according to the example of 2 working adults supporting 2 non-working family members, if they earn SMW rate of 37.5%, if they $37.5, then they only get the monthly income of $15,600, below the $16,795 CSSA payment, should they wish to receive so. So by setting up the SMW regime, the government has not lent a helping hand to the underprivileged. Instead, the SMW Commission continues to exploit the grassroots workers, so that even if there is a pay hike, the increase is eroded by inflation, and it is not fair. The SMW Commission owe it to the most underprivileged group in our working population. How can grassroots workers believe then that if they, or as long as they work hard, they'll be able to improve the life of their own and that of their family? I urge the new term of government to implement presidency's speech, and that the governance should be enhanced, and that the rights of grassroots workers should be safeguarded. First, the SMW regime should be reviewed so that SMW rates can be kept up with inflation increase. The purpose of SMW is to prevent excessively low wages. The government, therefore, should draw up indicators on this basis to find a link between SMW rate and the median wage, so that we can make sure for grassroots workers they can enjoy dignity in their life and has an incentive for working hard. There should also be a mechanism set up when no consensus can be reached on statutory minimum wage rates. The government should take the ultimate responsibility and introduce measures to prevent another freeze of the SMW rates, so as not to exploit the grassroots workers. Now, the SAR government and the chief executive are in the driver's seat, and we should have a capable government with an efficient market. So the government should take the wheel as they're in the driver's seat and adjust the SMW rate according to the inflation rate, so that people can firmly believe that as long as they work hard, they'll be able to improve the life of their own and that of their family. I so submit. Mr. Zhou Xiutong. Thank you, Mr. President. I support Mr. Wai-keung's motion and Mr. Ngan Man-yu's amendment. We have a biennial review cycle for SMW. In 2019, the government decided to freeze the statutory minimum wage rate. That means another 2 years in waiting. For 4 consecutive years, from 2019 to 2023, the SMW rate will remain at this frozen level of $37.5. 4 years can happen a lot. At lunch, I used to go down to this canteen to buy lunch, and a set lunch cost me $53,000. I don't know whether members recall that in 2018, the same set cost only $47. So in 4 years, the price has risen by 13%. Despite this freezing of the statutory minimum wage rate, prices continue to go up. Because of the government's decision, 14,300 grassroots workers have seen their purchasing power diminishing year after year. It is imminent for the government to introduce annual review of the SMW rate. The former Secretary for Labour and Welfare once mentioned that changing this review cycle is impossible. I don't agree. The SMW Commission at the moment bases data analysis on the CNSD's data. And the data is collected once every year. Even for civil service pay adjustment, there is an annual large-scale exercise to review the pay adjustment level. If this is possible, why can't we have annual review of the SMW rate? For countries with a minimum wage level, the level is reviewed once every year. UK, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. These countries conduct annual reviews as well. It's just a matter of will. So the government is just unwilling to have annual review of the rate. Now, Mr. President, I'd like to take this opportunity to state my view on SMW regime. There are different methods in determining minimum wage level around the world, and one credible method is to peg the SMW rate to per capita GDP. The prevailing concept is that if we have this connection, it shows the country's respect for the working population. We've compared this ratio in the US is 54%, in Europe, Switzerland is 63%, Germany 54%, UK, France 64%, Australia 58%, and then in Asia, in Japan 43%, South Korea 50%, Taiwan 42%, and then the mainland 58%. In Hong Kong, it's just 24%. There is objective data to suggest the following, let alone the 14,300 beneficiaries under the statutory minimum wage regime, that the rate is on the low side. The policy intent of the regime is to forestall excessively low wages and to prevent the loss of low-income jobs. We need to strike a balance between the two. And after introduction of the regime in 2011, we have never lost any low-income earning jobs. So the government hasn't truly implemented this policy intent. I'd like to borrow Presidency's word. I hope that the government will take resolute action and act swiftly to increase the minimum wage level and change the review cycle to once every year. Mr. Lee Chen-keung. The minimum wage rate has increased from originally $28 to $37.5. The original intent of the regime was to help grassroots workers to raise the minimum wage level to improve their living. In the past 11 years, however, it's just an utopia. The government could not realize this policy intent because their concern is that there will be a knock-on effect that as we raise the minimum wage level, it will induce inflation. But in the following, Mr. President, I'm going to illustrate the situation with some examples. Say in the catering industry, if you hire a dishwashing worker, you need to pay $10,000, even $20,000 a month. Now, if even a dishwashing worker gets $20,000 a month, imagine how much you should pay a restaurant manager or a waiter. And what does it mean in terms of how much breakfast costs? Before minimum wage, that is between year 2000 and 2011, the nominal wage index increased by 20%. And that the CPIA applicable to everybody in Hong Kong only rose by 9%. In 2011, after setting up the SMW regime, the nominal wage index in 2011, in the past 11 years rose by 60%, whereas the CPIA rose by 36% in the past 11 years. From the figures cited, if we compare the change, we will see that it's a fourfold increase. So it's apparent that minimum wage level would cause a substantial increase in wage costs across the board. Now, what happens if we have increased wage levels? This will hamper Hong Kong's competitiveness. In the APEC region, the business costs in Hong Kong have always remained high. According to the competitiveness report, the Hong Kong, in terms of competitiveness, we dropped from the first place in 2013 to the third place in 2021. In fact, because of the epidemic and the Black Cat riot, many SMEs are under a lot of pressure and they are in dire straits. And if the government arbitrarily increases the statutory minimum wage, then there'll be a knock-on effect, and definitely the costs would further spiral. After all, costs will be transferred to consumers, especially labor costs, and the operational costs would induce inflation, which will erode the spending power of the working population. And meanwhile, our competitiveness continues to be hampered because of rising wage costs, and in the end, it's a lose-lose for all. As I said at the outset, the purpose of setting up an SMW regime is what is the purpose? Is it to improve the living condition of the grassroots workers? Before SMW, in 2010, the poverty rate was 19%, with 1.21 million living in poverty. But in 2020, 1.65 million were living in poverty, with the poverty rate standing at 23.6%. So from the figures, we can see that the statutory minimum wage did not address the issue of those living in poverty. In fact, we have 380,000 working in Hong Kong and only 20,000 earning minimum wage level. That's 0.7% of all income earners. Some of them are unable to earn a higher income because of their disability or because of their age. So not many people can enjoy an increase in statutory minimum wage. Instead of considering increasing the minimum wage level, we should consider providing subsidy to the working population in order to address the issue of poverty and prevent the vicious circle.
多謝主席，我發言。
Mr. Lam Chen-sing, I speak in support of Mr. Wai-keung's motion. The number of employees making minimum wage made up 6.4%, but by 2010 it was only 0.7%, and it showed that the minimum wage regime was ineffective. Back in 2011, minimum wage was $28. Now it's $37.5. But when we look at a fillet-o-fish meal at McDonald's in 2011, it was $26. Now it is about $38.5. So we can see that it's difficult for minimum wage to catch up with prices. The minimum wage has been maintained at $37.5 since May 2015, and it was discussed in 2018, and it was based on an earlier survey, so there was a delay in data. And in early last year, the government decided to freeze MSW rate or SMW rate. Even if the rate is to be raised, it will only be implemented by May 2023. It means that the minimum wage of $37.5 would persist for at least 4 years, whereas the prices at restaurants continue to go up. So the problem lies with a delay in data and the biannual review cycle. The government should shorten or speed up the relevant studies and processes. Hong Kong can learn from the Minimum Wage Commission of the UK while waiting for the latest economic data. The views from employers and employees should be collected, and together with the latest economic data, adjustments could be made on minimum wage, and the process only takes 4 months. Speeding up the process, and by using the latest data, the SMW rate can reflect the actual living needs. The SMW ordinance stipulates that SMW rate must be reviewed at least once every 2 years. In other words, it does not rule out an annual review. So when inflation rises to a particular level, can we trigger a review of minimum wage? This is possible under the current legislation, but unfortunately, the government does not intend to do anything, and the review is conducted only every 2 years. We must establish standards to trigger immediate reviews of SMW instead of waiting 2 years. Currently, the Statutory Minimum Wage Commission would offer recommendations, and the Chief Executive and Council will make the decision. So the government holds the ultimate decision. The government should not shift the entire responsibility to the Commission at the last review without agreement from the labor sector or employees. Well, would the government consider the plight of the grassroots employees and to slightly raise the SMW level? The biannual review cycle leads to a serious delay in data, and the rate cannot catch up with changes in inflation, and the government refused to carry out a review more often. So there are more and more calls for an annual review, and there is a valid ground for it. Let's say if business environment was poor in a particular year, and that SMW rate would be frozen, but the economy might be revived swiftly. A review would adjust the rate closer to market conditions and reflect the commodity prices. And so I speak. Mr. Edward Lang, thank you. As President Xi pointed out, the people of Hong Kong have aspirations for a better life, and the grassroots are suffering, and we must consider how we can refine various policies, especially minimum wage, to ensure protection for the grassroots. SMW forestals excessively low wages while minimizing the loss of low-pay jobs and protect the grassroots. Ideally, employers and employees would forge a consensus so that they can achieve a win-win situation, but realistically, a minority of grassroots workers are still relying on adjustment in minimum wage before they can get a pay rise. But the biannual review cycle is insufficient, and grassroots employees suffered. And when SMW was implemented in 2011, the rate was $28 per hour. Now the latest rate is $37.5, and this rate was installed in May 2019. 10 years on, the cumulated increase was less than $10. Nowadays, you cannot even buy a meal box with $37.5. So for the grassroots employees who have contributed their hard work, and they are still living from paycheck to paycheck, that's why an annual review cycle must be implemented. And the government said that an annual review is not feasible, but if we want to allow people to live better lives, well, yet that could not be achieved because of the bureaucracy, then how can we answer the calls of the people? There was a lot of interest recently over the pay rise for civil servants, and that has to do with the annual pay trend survey. Can the government convince the people why the PTS is conducted every year for civil servants, while the SMW rate is only reviewed every 2 years? So technically, is an annual review of SMW rate possible, or is the government simply reluctant? There was a classic Cantopop song, and it says by contributing hard work, one would want to be rewarded. But the fact is prices are consistently going up while their pay might not, and that means more and more challenges for employees. So how can we achieve what President Xi, that is by working hard you can improve your own life and that for your family. We should achieve good governance, and in the area of SMW, the government must show commitment and willingness to change in order to provide basic safeguards for the grassroots. The business sector might be subject to pressure, but regardless of the regularity of the review, you can never prevent disagreements. When SMW was implemented in 2011, the business sector was concerned that some businesses might close down, but 11 years on, how many businesses actually folded because of minimum wage? I agree with adjustments to the mechanism, but that would require negotiations between employers and employees. The number of employees on minimum wage is gradually declining, so the business sector should not be concerned that an annual review would lead to a sharp rise in business costs, and as employers, they should take care of their employees' needs. Thank you. Mr. Frankie Yik. President, the Liberal Party does not agree with tackling poverty by using SMW. Tackling poverty requires different solutions, and the government cannot just rely on minimum wage. In May 2011, the initial SMW rate was $28 per hour. Now the rate is $37.5. However, the cumulative increase in rise over the past 11 years was 34%, which was similar to the cumulative inflation. But with the multiple up ratings, wages have gone up. Apart from a minority of employees still on minimum wage, their pay, they would enjoy a pay rise with a rise in SMW rate. Even for employees making more than minimum wage, their wages would also go up with an adjustment, and that would that ensures staff morale and prevent loss of employees. Over the past 10 years, nominal wage index went up by 60%, which far exceeded the inflation. There is a working population of 3.8 million, only about 20,000 or less than 1% are minimum wage. So these employees who are on minimum wage, they had different reasons for only making minimum wage. They are classified as the working poor. The government should provide policy support instead of consistently raising overall wages in Hong Kong by raising SMW rate. With population aging and low birth rates and lack of human resources, different industries have changes in recruiting. So we can see that wages will consistently go up. The cost of business in Hong Kong is relatively high compared with our neighbors. If the costs continue to go up, there will be dire consequences. Employers and employees rely on each other. Without employees, employers could not operate. So despite the impacts of the fifth wave, unemployment rose from 3.9 last year to 5.1% this year. Different industries are facing a shortage. So with the lack of supply, despite the freeze in SMW rate in the last 2 years, employers had to consistently raise wages. Under COVID-19, wages actually went up. In the last 2 years, nominal wage index went up by about 3%. So we could see that even without a rise in SMW rate, wages in the market would still be adjusted. If the wages offered are insufficient, the employees would simply jump ship. The exception would be employees who are not competitive enough. A number of labor-related legislation was passed recently, such as paternity leave, increase in statutory holiday days, abolition of MPF offsetting arrangement, and labor legislation relating to COVID-19. These pieces of law have increased the business costs in different ways, and SMEs in particular have taken a heavy hit given the economic situation and the looming pandemic. Raising the SMW rate substantially would place a heavier burden on SMEs, and eventually these SMEs would be forced to shrink their operations or even fold, and that would lead to a loss of jobs. I do not support the motion. Mr. Tommy Chang. President, SMW has been implemented in a number of countries, and there were controversies, and some believe it will lead to an increase in prices in many countries. Minimum wage has become a tool for politicians in their election campaigns, and this is a sugar-coated poison, and it was cited as a way to alleviate poverty. In a major economic recession, there is an excessive supply, and even if wages are low, they would be accepted by employees, and I would understand a minimum wage at this stage, but for Hong Kong, the level is the unemployment is only 2%. There's almost full employment. I do not agree with the idea of statutory minimum wage in Hong Kong. Ideally, wages should be based on market supply and demand, and the wage increase should be in line with productivity. So for employees who contribute to productivity, they should get a pay rise. And SMW is an interference of the free market for the catering business. We have different staff in the kitchen. If the lowest ranked staff has a pay rise, then others would follow suit, and that would lead to a substantial rise in business costs. So regulating minimum wage by way of law is a skewed approach, and that would jeopardize the competitiveness of the economy, especially for labor-intensive industries. Some developed economies also even saw an increase of unemployment to more than 4%, and there are other undesirable consequences on the society, and competitiveness is affected. Unscrupulous politicians propose minimum wage in Hong Kong, and they are proposing a 2.0 version. That is to install annual reviews instead of biannual reviews. The reason was to catch up with inflation, and I think this idea goes against the economic principles for Latin American countries like Brazil. The inflation is 300%. So would their wages go up by 300% per year? That would not be helpful at all. Market supply and demand and adjustment of wages. For the fourth quarter last year, the catering industry had to pay 16 to 20,000 for a staff member to wash dishes. Let's not confuse minimum wage with maximum wage. So even without adjusting minimum wage, Hong Kong's unemployment rate has remained at around 2%. And wages have been going up due to supply and demand. That's why I do not believe the SMW rate has to be raised in order to raise overall wages. SMW should be linked to productivity. So with greater productivity, one would deserve a pay rise. I do not believe the current SMW regime must be enhanced. The unscrupulous politicians wanted to raise the SMW rate without mentioning the fact that our competitiveness will be affected. The industry told us that for civil servants will see a pay rise of 2.5%, and they are being asked by their staff when they will get a pay rise. And Hong Kong has opportunities to integrate itself into the national development plans. So the SAR government's priority is to improve Hong Kong's business environment and competitive edge. Thank you.
Mr. Peter Shiu. Thank you, President. Today we are debating on the motion on improving the statutory minimum wage regime. For the labor sector, we understand that they are calling for more rights for the labor. We understand them. Still, do we want more people earning the SMW, or do we want more people earning a wage higher than SMW? That's the key question. Of course, we want people to get more wages. How many people are getting SMW right now? There are 3.35 million people working. Only 14,000 people are earning SMW. That means 99.5% of people are earning a wage higher than SMW. Well, I would call it a success. Many people are living better than SMW. So why do we still have to look at the question? If you want to take the remaining 0.05% of people away from SMW, then the question is, it is impossible to have every worker having the same ability and the same working attitude. Well, like our fingers, some are longer and some are shorter. That's why some people are appointed to positions of managing, to a managing position, and some people are working at a subordinate role. So if there is the demand, there will be supply. After implementation of the SMW in year 2011, many people lost their jobs. Some people have very low very low ability, but the employers let them keep their job. After the implementation of the SMW, these people even lost the job because of their poor ability. If you think there's insufficient protection for the 14,000 people earning SMW, well, there is something called the working allowance. The working allowance. There are people who have a limited ability because of old age, sickness, or disabilities. So we want to care for them by giving them allowances. Say they earn $10,000, the government can give them an extra $8,000. I think that's fine. If that is their work, if they have if they are not very capable, should we mandate the wage to be set at $15,000? If that's the case, no business will be able to operate. Or like Lee Jian-keung said, you would be transferring the cost to consumers. So In the past, a meal only cost $30. Now it costs $60. That's why. After the implementation of the SMW back in 2011, many people said that it would improve people's life and it would narrow the wealth gap. So now the wealth gap is at its highest. The Gini coefficient is at its highest. 10 years on, it's still like this. Can you tell me why? There are some people saying that it is because of the price of housing. Well, if you ask the retail sector, the rents for shops have dropped by 50 or even 60%. With such cheaper rent, why aren't we having cheaper food? Well, I think it's because of these wages. So those who are calling for a review of the SMW regime, please think about whether it is good for the economy as a whole. Well, whether it is a biennial or an annual review is not important. Even if you have a review every month, well, would you? Yes, you can raise the SMW, but what about reducing it? If you can only raise the SMW but not decrease it, it's not reasonable. Well, according to Dr. Lo Chi-kwong, it is not that the law mandated a biennial review. It is that the Commission is required to report to the CE every 2 years. So you can have a review every month. Every time there is a consultation, study, analysis, you don't give them sufficient time to work, and then you adjust the rates. It's meaningless. Thank you, Mr. Sunny Tang. I speak in opposition to the motion moved by Mr. Wai-keung. We have to consider the impact on the operating costs in order to maintain competitiveness and a favorable business environment. The motion says that the original policy intent of SMW is to forestall excessively low wages. It is a false statement. The Minimum Wage Commission terms of reference states that there is a balance to be struck between forestalling excessively low wages and the minimizing the loss of low-paid jobs. And also, we have to sustain Hong Kong's economic growth and competitiveness. So besides forestalling excessively low wages, we have to consider our competitiveness. If you look at the history, there is no strong capitalists and weak workers scenario. According to the LWB's figure, between the end of last year and February this year, the lowest 10th percentile earner, taking away the impact of inflation, the real increase compared with the implementation of SMW was 28%. So just now, the Secretary has mentioned that as well. It shows that the SMW regime has improved the livelihood and offered protection to grassroots workers. Now, we have the inflation right now. After years, after multiple uprating, it is sufficient to protect the lowest earner. Now, the people benefiting from the system has dropped from 6.4% to 0.2%. That is some 14,000 people. To address poverty, the government should focus on supporting the 0.5% working population with other social welfare measures, or support conventional or traditional industries to transform and upgrade, to diversify our market and economy to address people's livelihood issue. Hong Kong is a free economy. The wage level should be decided by market adjustments so as to maintain our competitiveness. Employers and the government have always, the business sector is always caring for the workers' benefits. Whenever it is possible, we would raise workers' wages. However, uprating SMW is not the solution to the root problem. It would decrease employers' willingness to hire, and it would cause a lose-lose scenario. It is against the original policy intent. According to the call to use a formula to calculate SMW, I think if we use a formula, we can only rely on historical figures. it lacks risk assessment, and also it is not forward-looking, and it is not desirable. As an open economy, our economic performance is affected by local factors and external factors. At present, the situation is still unstable. Businesses are facing immense pressure. According to the Q1 economic report released in May, the real GDP has contracted by 4% year on year. External trade decreased by 4.5%. The government rolled out the Employment Support Scheme 2.0 exactly because the government is aware of the plight faced by the businesses. With the uncertainties of the global business environment resulting from the epidemic and the Russia-Ukraine war and the high energy price, the three major indexes of the United States have dropped by 20% in the past half year. The Hang Seng Index has dropped by 1,500 points. It shows the pessimism of the investors, and it presages a recession globally. It is not the right time to adjust the SMW, and in the future, when we adjust the SMW, we have to consider our economic situation and our competitiveness. Employers and employees should work together and come over on the other side. Thank you. Ms. Lam So White. Thank you, President. I thank Mr. Wai-keung for moving today's motion so that members can put forward their views on SMW. It has been some 10 years since its implementation, but there is still a lot of controversy. Because of the social movements and the COVID-19 epidemic, businesses are struggling, workers are having a hard time, and it exacerbated the disputes between employers and employees. Now, in terms of efficacy, it has been 11 years since implementation. It has been running smoothly. The worries about a massive wave of job loss or closure have not occurred, and it has unleashed the female and working population and enhance our competitiveness. And also, SMW has helped improve the livelihood of grassroots workers. Back in 2011, there were 186,000 SMW earners. Now there are just 14,000. And also in year 2011, there were 14,000 applications for CSSA. In year 2021, there were only 2,880% drop. Grassroots people are earning more money, and they don't have to apply for CSSA. It is good. However, there's still a lot of criticism on SMW. First, its efficacy to alleviate poverty is still in doubt. According to the poverty reports in year 2020, the poverty rate in Hong Kong was 23.6% with a 1.65 million poor population. That is 1 in 4 Hong Kong people is poor. Unbelievably, there were 800,000, that is 50% of the working population, of the poverty population was working. Inflation has eroded the real income of workers. No matter how hard grassroots people work, they still can't ensure a reasonable living standard. In the past few years, the incentivized effect of SMW has receded. According to the Census and Statistics Department's in March, the working population participation rate has dropped to 58.1%, the lowest in the past decades. Since year 2019, after the uprating of SMW to 37.5%, grassroots workers did not have a pay rise for 3 years, and it is lagging behind inflation. And sometimes the people say that it is better to apply for CSSA. Recently, many businesses are hiring more part-time workers to replace full-time employees. Some employers want to avoid a cap 418, so they keep the weekly working hours below 18 hours, or even they are forced self-employment. The SMW regime has been in place for 11 years. We think this is the right time to review it, and there are several suggestions on my part. First of all, the Minimum Wage Commission would refer to a basket of factors and make a report to the CE. However, there are still a lot of disputes concerning the recommendation. The government can engage an independent third party like universities to participate in the formulation of the report and give factors, quote factors concerning energy, electricity, food, and so on into the report, so that the figure is more reflective of the plight of the grassroots people. And second, we have to review the continuous contract regulation under Cap 418 to protect the welfare of full-time and part-time workers. And also the government should deal with the problem of forced self-employment with enforcement, inspection, and enhancing the punishment. In terms of working poverty, the government should relax the eligibility criteria for working family allowance, for example, enhancing the amount of the allowance so as to support low-income households and prevents them from falling into the social security net. President, we want everyone to have a job and have a good life. That is a very humble wish, but it is not too achievable in Hong Kong. So I hope the government can enhance the system to offer more protection to employees. Thank you. Mr. Louis Lung. President, I thank Mr. Wai-keung for moving today's motion. However, I do not agree with some of the statements made in the motion. Now, from the legal perspective, from reasonableness and from on a compassionate perspective, I would like to comment on the SMW. According to the ordinance, the Minimum Wage Commission would make a report at least every 2 years concerning the SMW. That's not the maximum number of review allowed per 2 years. In the past 2 years, the rate was reviewed every 2 years. I believe there is a good reason for that. Many members said that the SMW rate should be reviewed every year. I am open to this, but if that's not achievable, I think the government has to explain the reasons to the public. And about justifications, there are views that the business sector has always been exaggerating the impact of uprating SMW on their businesses. Well, referring to the public consultation conducted by the Commission between April and May this year, the figure told us that among different industries, payroll cost accounts for 37.5% among the total cost. It's worth noting that for specific industries, the payroll cost accounts for a much higher percentage in the total cost. For example, a property management industry at 55.9%, cleaning services 74.8%, security service as high as 80.5%. When after uprating SMW rates, the operating costs for these industries will be significantly increased. So besides caring for SMW earners, let's not forget the industries with a high percentage of payroll costs. They will have a very difficult time after the uprating. Now, from a compassionate perspective, employees usually do not stand in the shoes of employers in viewing SMW. That's understandable. However, many employees are also employers. They would hire foreign domestic helpers. They want to hire FDH who can speak Cantonese, who can cook good food, who are good at caring children and elderly people. They would not hire FDH who are unskilled. This is logical. The SMW is only the floor of a statutory wage. If the wage level is set too high, those low-skilled, poorly educated, and old-age workers would be easily outcompeted. So it is very difficult to reach a consensus on this matter. We don't have to rush through it. We have to stay calm rather than turning this policy, which is a protection, a safeguard for employees, into a cause of dispute. We have to search for a common ground. So I hope the new term of the government and Legislative Council members will continue to put their thoughts together on this front. Thank you.
Mr. Rincon. Thank you, Mr. President. I speak in support of the motion moved by Mr. Wai-keung and the amendment moved by Mr. Hon NGAN Man-yu. According to studies, for countries with a minimum wage level, there are over 100 affecting different low-income earning jobs. The purpose is, on the one hand, improve the living condition of low-income earners and also to alleviate poverty situation. This is an important arrangement in terms of improving employment relationships. However, there has always been a lack of standardized approach on setting minimum wage levels. Each country will have regard to their own circumstances and the labor situation and make necessary adjustments. In terms of the economic situation in Hong Kong, we've been hit hard by the epidemic in the past 3 years. The employment situation is quite pessimistic. According to the latest statistics, in 2022, between January and March, the working population decreased from 3.61 million to 3.55 million by April this year, down by some 51,000. Well, although the epidemic situation is gradually subsiding with unemployment rate going down, under such circumstances, we need to emphasize that the mechanism should be flexible. It should also have regard to the reality. Comparing to other advanced economies such as Germany, US, UK, South Korea, Japan, in terms of the beneficiaries of the minimum wage levels, the adjustment mechanisms, they have a proper regime with a clear delineation of responsibilities. They also tend to mete out heavier penalties. Say in the UK in 1998, the UK introduced the Minimum Wage Act, and there are different age bands with different levels applicable. With an annual review cycle. In 2016, the UK also introduced a national living wage, which is generally higher than the minimum wage because reference is made to expenses on traffic and transport, education, food, etc. For the lowest quartile of the working population and young workers, the living wage could help them a lot. And after introducing national living wage, the number of people the number of low-income earners dropped. And in 2016, the figure was 19.3%. For the first time, it dropped below 20%. In other words, this mechanism has positive effect on the labor market in UK. In Hong Kong, we have the long-standing problem of wealth gap. In the past 10 years, the number of billionaires have increased. At the same time, we have more people living in poverty. As one of the advanced economies in Asia, the minimum wage level in Hong Kong, however, lags far behind other countries such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. After computing the minimum wage levels, their level exceeds $40 per hour, 40 Hong Kong dollars per hour, whereas for Hong Kong the rate is $37.5. And for the countries I mentioned, as well as in Beijing, the wage increase all surpassed Hong Kong. And that is why we must holistically review the SMW regime in Hong Kong, consider the impact on employees and employers. The terms of reference of the SMW Commission should be reviewed, and the SMW should be used as an administrative means to address the issue of wealth gap in Hong Kong. For civilized places around the world, there should be more importance attached to the grassroots workers and care for the underprivileged. This should also be what we seek to address in Hong Kong. Mr. Edmund Wong. Mr. Wai-keung has moved the motion basically to review the SMW arrangement and to shorten the cycle to once every year. I agree, but I'd like to explain the following. I don't agree with everything. For example, the explanation from Mr. Wai-keung is that we have strong capitalists and weak workers. In other words, he said that all employers are on the strong side and all workers on the weak side. I cannot agree. I believe that all employers and those in the human resources would tell you that basically the so-called strong capitalists and weak workers is not non-existent. It's the other way around. In fact, some clients in the catering industry have been so aggrieved. They've been complaining about lack of manpower, and for some low-earning jobs, they may not be able to hire sufficient hands even if they pay $50, $70 an hour. Sometimes employers have to beg employees to go to work. So under such circumstances, how would you call it strong capitalists and weak workers? Of course, I know in some industries, some workers are only earning the minimum wage, and according to Mr. Kwok, 0.27% are earning a minimum wage rate. But I want to stress that employers and employees have a really close connection. They are mutually dependent. It's not the case of one side stronger than the other. Employers also rely on employees to do business. Well, in fact, one company just announced allowing workers to go to work just 4.5 days a week. And we do have good bosses in Hong Kong. I hope that other members, especially members from the labor sector, would stop smearing employers, because we are not confrontational. We need to work together to solve problems. The original motion also refers to the original intent, which is to forestall excessively low wages, and that it is connected to poverty alleviation. I think it's kind of a fallacy. In fact, Mr. NGAN Man-yu, my fellow party member, has put in an amendment that is a balance should be struck between forestalling excessively low wages and minimizing the loss of low-paid jobs and sustain Hong Kong's economic growth and competitiveness. These are all policy intents of a statutory minimum wage. In fact, we have on numerous occasions discussed how we can maintain Hong Kong's competitiveness and promote economic development. So I will save the speech. I just say that we should take a comprehensive approach in considering minimum wage. It's not a simple issue. It's a complex issue, and Hong Kong is a rapidly changing society. Of course, we need to safeguard the rights and benefits of grassroots workers. Meanwhile, we also need to have regard to a basket of factors, state of the economy, competitiveness, and social inclusiveness. If we only consider one single aspect, that is to prevent excessively low wages, without having regard to the competitiveness of Hong Kong and whether we can salvage businesses, then, like Mr. Peter Shield said, we can have a review once every quarter, once every month even. I understand the members speaking out for the labor sector, but we need to take a more holistic view. Last week, when President Xi visited Hong Kong, he advocated 4 musts. One of the musts is that we must maintain Hong Kong's distinctive status and advantages. And apart from safeguarding the rights of grassroots workers, we also need to ensure that Hong Kong maintains open to businesses so that we can attract capital to do business in Hong Kong. Only when we have vibrant economic activities would we be able to achieve what Mr. Kwok said, and that is to bring dignity in for the grassroots workers. I support the amendment but not the motion. Mr. Michael Tian. Mr. President, the statutory minimum wage has been set up for many years, and last year it had a crisis. For the first time, because of the epidemic, the SMW rate was frozen. I am sure that the labor sector would be unhappy, but this quite unprecedented epidemic has caused a lot of suffering. We all hope that we could be it would be over soon, so that there wouldn't be another crisis and the rate would not be frozen again. I think the controversy of this motion is review of the level once every year. In fact, at the outset, we have always bickered about whether the review cycle should be annual or biannual. It's just a matter of our stance and our perspective. Under normal circumstances, we would expect an increase in the statutory minimum wage. So naturally, the employers would like a slower pace of adjustment, and the contrary for the labor sector. It's been a decade since the regime has been established, and we've collected sufficient data to have an objective discussion on these two subjective views. In 2013, the first review took place. In 2019, we had the latest review, and the rate was 7.1%, 8.3%, 6.15%, and 8.75%. The respective inflation rates, meanwhile, were 8.5%, 7.4%, 3.9%, and 5.3%. So, by comparison, basically, the SMW rate hike surpassed the rise in inflation. I believe the major reason is that with a biennial review cycle, the SMW Commission had sufficient time to consider all the factors. So after deducting inflation, there is still a real growth in the SMW rate. If we shorten the cycle to once every year, the SMW Commission may not have time to consider all the factors. Now, instead of pondering the issue, they might just go for the same increase in inflation. So I'm just worried about the outcome of an annual review cycle, despite all good intentions. At the same time, I understand that, of course, the labor sector would like to have a shorter review cycle. So, having balanced all views, despite having an annual cycle benefiting employees in general, I'm going to abstain from voting.
Mr. Michael Look. President, I'm happy to see that Mr. Wai-keung moved this motion to improve the statutory minimum wage regime. I heard the speeches of different members, and there was little controversy over the idea of an annual review. The main point of contention is about the idea of minimum wage, or the intent. I'd like to offer a rebuttal to some of the points. Mr. Lee Chun-keung committed a logical fallacy. That is the so-called lamppost effect. He talked about inflation, and that was the only factor he considered, and he blamed inflation on minimum wage because that's where he put the spotlight on. But the phenomenon was actually the result of the different factors. Since minimum wage was installed in 2011, Hong Kong has seen mild inflation. For those who know about the economy or how the financial systems work, after the financial tsunami in 2009, the United States have consistently carried out quantitative easing, and Hong Kong has the linked exchange rate in place, pegged to the USD. So with an excessive monetary supply, prices of land, properties, rent went up, and these led to inflation. Well, if pay rise leads to inflation, it could be a happy problem, but the fact is that the pay rise has been very limited. So for those who know about finances or the economy, they would know that inflation is about monetary supply. They cannot blame the problem on employees, especially those who are just making minimum wage. This is really unfair for the employees. And there was a concern that raising the minimum wage might create a ripple effect, and in turn that affects Hong Kong's competitiveness. Hong Kong's competitive edge is never about trying to pay people less. We are an international city. We should be looking at high value-added industries. Under the National 14th Five-Year Plan, we should focus on high value-added industries. When we talk about our competitiveness, it's about the lack of diversity in our industries, or we should be talking about the black-clad violence in the past. Raising wages would not affect Hong Kong's competitiveness, and you certainly cannot blame it on the employees. Indeed, it's not easy to forge a consensus over the issue of wages in the society. Employers are reluctant to raise pay while employees are looking for more. And some people said that raising minimum wage could not help tackle poverty. Well, if that is true, that is only because the rise is inadequate. Any wage or pay rise could not catch up with the economy, and the poverty gap has actually widened. It's not that minimum wage is ineffective, it's just that we are not raising it enough. Some people propose targeted subsidy. We are not against the idea, but if we rely on government subsidy, does it mean the government is paying salaries on the behalf of employers? At the legislature, we should achieve harmony and forge a consensus. The economy comprises of different, or the cycle comprises of different processes, including supply, distribution, etc. If employees can make more, they can spend more, and that could in turn create more jobs. All around the world, the implementation of minimum wage has proved this idea. We should have an annual review of statutory minimum wage. Please stop speaking. Does any other member wish to speak?
Mr. Kwok Wai-keung, you may now speak on the amendment. Thank you, Mr. President. In the past 2 days, all members are familiar with Presidency's important speech, and we will earnestly learn about the 4 musts. And of course, it is a patriot's duty to address people's difficulties in life. Now, after learning his speech, how do we translate words into action? If we do nothing, are we going to address the problem of wealth gap? How do we make people firmly believe that as long as they work hard, they'll be able to improve the life of their own and that of their family? Why is it that Mr. Xi Jinping urges us to dismantle the barrier of vested interest? I think it's food for thought, and I thank Mr. Man-yu for moving an amendment, and I thank 20 members, including myself, who have spoken and offered their views. And I can see clearly there are 2 sides. And I have reservations about Mr. Ngan's amendment. The amendment keeps the review of the mechanism for determining a minimum wage level, and also to ensure that employees receiving minimum wages enjoy dignity in toiling. But there are also some parts which he has deleted, and in fact the deleted phrases contain our determination of the matter, and if we just cherry pick, it seems that it's not wholesome. For example, according to Mr. An, the phrase "due to lack of the objective criteria for determining so and so" are deleted, and if this part is taken out, are we talking about a fundamental review or just a small-scale review? And also this part, minimum wage as one of the poverty alleviation policies, is deleted. If this part is deleted, does it mean that it has no correlation to poverty alleviation? And if that is the case, it's difficult to raise our discussion to the policy level. If we continue to create working poverty because of minimum wage, it doesn't do. We want to address the issue of the working poor. Finally, can earn wages sufficient to make a living and maintain a reasonable standard of living in exchange for their labor? This part, again, has been proposed to be deleted. And according to presidency, we must make people firmly believe that as long as they work hard, they can improve their lives and that of their family. And this is consistent with what I have proposed. I urge members not to support the amendment. And as pointed out by presidency, we need to address the wealth gap and distribution of wealth in Hong Kong, and we also need to earnestly dismantle the barrier of vested interests before we can tackle challenges, so that we can allow more to share the fruit of economic development more fairly, so that we can listen to the people's aspirations. I urge members to support the motion.
Secretary for Labour and Welfare. President, once again, I thank Mr. Wai-keung for moving this motion, as well as Mr. NGAN Man-yu for moving an amendment, and 18 other members who spoke on the motion. I now offer a consolidated response on the views and recommendations offered. As I pointed out in my opening speech, the policy objective of statutory minimum wage is the result of years of discussions and deliberations in the society, and it was an important milestone in protecting labor rights. The policy objective of SMW is to provide a wage floor which forestalls excessively low wages without unduly jeopardizing Hong Kong's labor market flexibility, economic growth and competitiveness, and minimizing the loss of low-paid jobs. And members had a debate over the theme of competitiveness, and from competitiveness reports offered by different rating agencies, Hong Kong has always ranked among the top, so we could see that SMW did not affect our competitiveness. The implementation of, after SMW was implemented, there were 4 up ratings, and the employment earnings of grassroots employees improved substantially. From February to April 2022, the average monthly employment earnings of full-time employees, excluding government employees and live-in domestic workers to whom SMW does not apply, of the lowest decile group, rose cumulatively by 74.2% compared with the pre-SMW period, translating into an increase of 26.2% in real terms after accounting for inflation. Some members mentioned the 2020 annual earnings and hours survey conducted by the Census and Statistics Department. From May to June last year, only 14.3 employees were making the SMW rate of $37.5 per hour. They made up 0.5% of all employees. I wish to point out that from the experience since the implementation of SMW, whenever the SMW rate was raised, in order to maintain the pay difference between different ranks, employers would often raise the wages of employees who were making higher than the SMW rate, and as such, the number of employees benefiting from the SMW was actually higher than the number of employees actually on the SMW rate. Some members said that the growth of SMW lagged behind inflation. The fact is, when SMW was implemented in May 2011, the rate was $28 per hour. After 4 upratings, it increased to $37.5 by May 2019, or a cumulative increase of 33.9%. In the same period, the growth of CPIA was 29.9%. In other words, the cumulative rise in SMW rates exceeded inflation, and the purchasing power could be maintained compared with 2011 when the initial SMW rate was set. Due to a rise in CPI from May 2019 to May 2022, the purchasing power of the current SMW rate is inevitably a bit lower than May 2019. The Minimum Wage Commission is now conducting a review on SMW rate. They would refer to an array of indicators, including general economic conditions, labor market conditions, competitiveness, and social inclusion. Inflation is among the factors to be considered by the Commission, but it is not the sole factor. Some members wondered whether the SMW rate could support the basic living of employees, and they recommend that basic household living needs be considered when drawing up the SMW rate in order to achieve the level of living wages. Like I said, the policy objective of SMW regime is to provide a wage floor to forestall excessively low wages. The idea is different from the concept of living wages. The government currently has no plan to change the policy objective of SMW or to establish a separate statutory living wage on top of minimum wage. Some members believe that minimum wage might be one of the reasons for the working poor. I'd like to stress that the SMW regime provides a wage floor to forestall excessively low wages, and enterprises might offer pay higher than the SMW level to employees based on operating and market conditions, and therefore the SMW would not lead to working poverty. In fact, the number of employees on SMW rate only makes up 0.5% of all employees in Hong Kong. Even though SMW would help improve employment earnings of low-paid workers, it is not the only means to tackle working poverty. The government has taken out a series of targeted measures to improve the earnings of grassroots families and low-paid workers, including the Working Family Allowance Scheme rolled out in April 2018. A number of improvement measures was implemented on top of the original low-income Working Family Allowance Scheme, for instance, by relaxing the application criteria, increasing the allowance levels twice substantially, and allowing household members to make applications by combining their working hours. And the result is that more eligible households could receive the allowance and become self-reliant. To enhance protection for non-skilled employees hired by government service contractors, since April 2019, the government rolled out a series of targeted measures for tender documents for new tender exercises that hire non-skilled workers. The weightings of technical assessments and wage levels have been increased, and contractors were asked to provide contract gratuities to employees. At the end of 2020, the government completed a review on the above improvement measures, which showed that the wages committed in government service contracts went up by about 24%. Some members believe that the SMW rate should exceed the Standard Payment for Comprehensive Social Security Allowance Scheme, or CSSA. The CSSA provides for those who are old, sick, handicapped, unemployed, or have a low income in order to meet their basic living needs. It is a safety net, and as such, it has a different policy objective compared with minimum wage, and the two are not comparable. Some members ask whether the SMW rate would affect inflation in Hong Kong. The fact is, inflation is affected by a number of factors, such as the macroeconomic environment, international commodity prices, costs locally, and the adjustment to SMW rate is only one of the factors. Since SMW was installed, inflation has remained mild. The last 4 up ratings of SMW rate did not place an obvious burden on inflation. Some members were concerned that with minimum wage, certain employees with hampered capabilities might be forced to quit the employment market or labor market. According to the minimum wage ordinance, both handicapped and able-bodied employees are protected by minimum wage. A special arrangement is in place to allow handicapped employees to receive an assessment so that they can choose to receive minimum wage or a pay level based on their capabilities, and that guarantees the welfare and opportunities for those employees. Some members ask whether minimum wage would lead to fragmentation in the labor market. And according to the Earnings and Hours Survey, the employment of part-time workers is normally affected by the economy. The labor market did not see fragmentation as a result of minimum wage. Some members talked about the mechanism to conduct a review, and that a review should be conducted annually. They also propose establishing a formula to adjust the SMW rate, for instance, by looking at the median hourly pay, labor force participation rate, or inflation. Some wages believe that wage levels should be dictated by the market, and the current SMW rate is enough to protect the welfare or earnings of low-paid workers, and there's no need to change the mechanism for adjusting SMW rate. According to the minimum wage ordinance, the Commission must make a report at least once every 2 years on the request of the Chief Executive. The ordinance does not prohibit the Chief Executive from requesting an annual review from the Commission. Under the current mechanism, the areas of work such as research and analysis and consultation associated with the review could only be carried out in the framework of a biennial review. If we are to have an annual review, we must drastically speed up the process of research, analysis, and consultation, or use a formula to adjust the SMW rate. The former is a technical adjustment under the current framework, while the latter, that is using a formula, would require substantial amendment of our ordinance and a reform of the current framework, and we would have to seek consensus afresh. The society has different views over the review cycle of SMW. Since the Commission's review is underway, our priority is for the Commission to fully consider relevant factors in accordance with the ordinance and forge a consensus over the recommended SMW rate. Once the Commission completes the review and has submitted a report, the Labor and Welfare Bureau would explore the review cycle of SMW or whether the approach needs to be adjusted. President, once again, I thank members for their views and recommendations. Thank you.
I now call upon Mr. N. Man-yu to move an amendment. Mr. President, I move my amendment. I propose a question to you that Mr. N. Man-yu's amendment be passed. I now put the question to you as stated. Mr. Tommy Chung claims division. The bell will ring for 5 minutes.
開始表決。
Please vote.
請核對所
Please check your votes. If there are no questions, voting is closed. The results are displayed. From Election Committee, 24 present, 12 for, 2 against, 10 abstentions. From FCs and GCs, 36 present, 13 for, 9 against, 13 abstentions. I think the question is not agreed by a majority of each of the two groups of members present. I declare the amendment negative. Mr. Kwok Wai-keung, you still have 34 seconds to reply. The debate will come to a close. Mr. President, addressing people's difficulties is now a task for patriots. We must translate words into action. We must be pragmatic and do real work. I agree that on the basis of mutual understanding, we should all promote the development of Hong Kong and improve people's livelihood. And I put the question to you that Mr. Kwok Wai-keung's motion be passed. Mr. Tommy Cheung claims a division. The bell will ring for 5 minutes.
開始。
Voting begins. Please check your votes. If there are no questions, voting is closed. The results are displayed. From the Election Committee, 24 present, 8 for, 2 against, 14 abstentions. From Functional and Geographical Constituencies, 36 present, 7 for, 9 against, 19 abstentions. The question is not agreed by majority of each of the two groups of members present. I declare the motion negatived. The Council is now adjourned until 11 a.m. the 13th of July 2022, Wednesday.